It's my pleasure to begin to get us started. Welcome, everyone, to Goodwin University. This is the ambassador was so sweet to us. He's been here for 2 days, and we're working him in a way that is just should not be fair or right. And I call him the ambassador. He said that back in the day, during the movement, everyone was called by their first names except for Dr. King. And Dr. King had a doctor before it. Everybody else was his first name, but I can't bring myself to that. So it is the ambassador and will remain the ambassador. Can you imagine what a blessing we all live in? That for me, I get to operate an institution where I have people of this stature that I get to meet in regular course of this life. And can you imagine for all of us that for a brief moment, we are stepping into history in a way that just doesn't happen naturally. And that happens through things like the World Affairs Council who makes that happen for us. Yesterday we had students here, and I was trying to explain to them that what they're about to see and hear, they only get out of a textbook nowadays. I mention often that there are 2 words for history in Swahili. One of them is a history that people remember and talk about, and the other history is that which only is far enough back that no one was there anymore, but they talk about it. It's very rare and special that we are able to talk to someone who was actually there and lived that history. So with that, I'll turn it over to Megan Torrey. Thank you so much for doing this with me, Megan.
Well, no, thank you, Mark, and thank you for your perennial wisdom in being such a wonderful partner to the World Affairs Council and to this community. And I also want to thank our chairman, Peter Kelly, who's with us today as well for all his help with this event. This is quite extraordinary for the World Affairs Council to be hosting you, Ambassador Young. We are so grateful to be here today. This is really historically significant, and so thank you all for being with us. So actually, Jeffrey, you and I might switch in a minute here. So we're going to use this as an opportunity to tape this for our series State of the World. So this will also be turned into our podcast and our web show. And so you're in on this live taping of State of the World, and this is very exciting. So the format today is we're going to do a little bit of moderated Q&A, and then all of you, we want you to participate. So you should have cards to write your questions. We're going to ask the questions from the podium so we're able to capture all of the audio. So actually, Jeffrey, do you want to switch? Let's switch. So we have a wonderful moderator with us today, Jeffrey Ogbar from the University of Connecticut. He's not only a professor of history, but he's also the founding director of the Center for Popular Music and an author of many books. But of course, our special guest is you, Ambassador Young, civil rights icon, congressman, statesman, ambassador, mayor of the city of Atlanta, friend of our World Affairs Council in Atlanta, of course, who needs no introduction. So welcome, gentlemen.
Let me apologize first because I got upset on this morning's news. And what got me upset was, my friend, can't even remember his name now, on MSNBC, Al Sharpton. And he was talking about going to see the president and to fuss with him about what he's doing, and he needs to. I got mad because that's not the way we dealt with any president. And I almost think that Americans right now are so spoiled. They expect somebody to solve all the problems of the world. And so if there's no baby food, they want to call the government and raise hell. And what I wanted to apologize for was what kept going through my mind when I sat down here. And it's an old World War II expression, a snafu. And do you remember what it means?
Oh, yes.
That's what I think the state of the world is. It's normal. The situation normal. But I just turned 90 the last couple of months ago, and it's always been upset. And that's what we were put on earth for, to straighten things out. And, well, the poem, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's got tacks in it, places where there ain't no carpet on the floor. Black people particularly have never expected the world to be right. I mean, that's what we were put here for, to get it right. And we were given dominion over the earth. And if it's all messed up, it's because we've messed it up or because we haven't done anything to straighten it out. And when Martin Luther King, and I went with Martin Luther King to see President Johnson. Now, they were on opposite sides of almost everything in 1964. But coming back from Martin receiving the Nobel Prize, we went to see President Johnson, and it was like I was witnessing a pastoral counseling. He never said a critical word to Lyndon Johnson. They knew what they stood for, but it was Martin trying to help President Johnson deal with problems that had really come from Kennedy as much as anybody else. And it was like two brothers saying, we got a problem. And so when we talked about voting rights, Lyndon Johnson said, I know you're right, Dr. King, but I just don't have the power. We just passed the 64 Civil Rights Act, which was, I think, 2nd of July of that year. This was about the 20th of December, same year. He said, I just can't go back to the Congress with another major voting rights act when we just got through with the Civil Rights Act. And every time Dr. King raised a question, President Johnson's answer was always the same. You're right, I agree with you. I just don't have the power. When we left, I agreed with the president. And I said, he didn't have the power and you don't either. And I said, this was 1964, almost 65. And I said, you've been going constantly since 1955. He finished his doctoral dissertation and put it in the mail to Boston University And the next week, Rosa Parks sits down in the bus. And he had not had a vacation or time off. He'd been jailed and bombed and stabbed. And I mean, he'd just been through hell for 10 years. And so I said, you need to, this is a good time. The president doesn't have any power, and you don't either. And not only that, he's got money, but you ain't even got no money. No staff that's worthwhile, including me. And none of us know what's going on. This is a time for you to take a sabbatical. Go somewhere and write and read. Take your wife, and relax, and kind of get everything together. And he said, no. I said, well, what you gonna do? He said, we're gonna get the president some power. And I said, come on. He went to Morehouse where you went. And I said, you Morehouse men, we always say, you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much.
That's the saying, but you can always tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him, and he's not being vulgar, because the more you're being very polite, because you can't tell him. Thank you very much for being polite.
No, but I'm saying that's what I told him, see? And everything I said, he'd come back. We got to get the president some power. And I said, we ain't got no money. You got no votes. I mean, you don't even have a decent staff, including me. Say, and you're going to help the president. I said, that's the most arrogant thing I've ever heard you say. And he normally would come back and put me in my place and shut me up. But this time he just kept saying, we got to get the president some power. And he was thinking of spiritual power, not political power, not military power, not economic power. And I didn't understand that then. But jumping to the end of March, by the last week in March, the president was standing up before a joint session of Congress saying we shall overcome and introduce the voting rights bill. So we got the president some power. But none of us knew how to do it. But he was thinking of spiritual power, not political or social economic power. And I didn't get that. But 2 days after we got back from Washington, who comes to his office but Mrs. Amelia Boynton of Selma? And she tells him what's going on in Selma, and he says, we'll come over there on the 2nd of January. And we just moved everything to Selma. And it took about 3 months to mobilize the nation. And everybody remembers the John Lewis walk across the bridge, which in itself was an accident. I mean, it was on the wrong day. That the reason he wasn't there was that the 7th of March was the first Sunday, and all the preachers have to be in their pulpits the first Sunday. But normally, if it had not been a leap year, you normally figure 7th is a second Sunday. I mean, the 7th is the, not, yeah, well, everybody got it wrong. And so he wasn't there when all the people showed up ready to march. And actually, if he had been there, Lyndon Johnson would have probably sent down the Justice Department, and there would have been protection, more protection, and we wouldn't have had a Bloody Sunday. And so I don't know, but I don't worry about the state of the world because, well, really and truly, I'm a preacher, and I believe he's got the whole world in his hands.
Ambassador Young, I want to say first to everyone here, to Goodwin College, to World Affairs Council, this is an outstanding event. And I'm looking around the room here and I'm seeing all the flags. This is a very appropriate question and to segue from your comments around the civil rights movement. I have a quote from you, and you say that, and we had this conversation in the green room about Ambassador Young coming to Harvard Seminary, and really things sort of just happening that he didn't really plan for. Like he just sort of showed up, and he didn't know anything about Harvard, didn't know anything about the Harvard Seminary. And he comes here, and then he finds out about a rare scholarship that no one had taken, and then he gets this scholarship. And he says that, this is the quote that it ties into what you told us earlier this morning, that I wasn't predicted to be anything. I just followed my inner spirit, and it put me in the right place at the right time. I didn't want to be mayor of Atlanta. I didn't want to run for Congress. I didn't want to work for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I wanted to work close with him and be a writer and write about the movement. And the interesting thing is that as your life is not that you just sort of like, fumbled up. You have extraordinary talents and you're brilliant and you've been a statesman. But when we think about the civil rights movement, very few people think about the international implications of the movement. And so your becoming an ambassador in many ways doesn't seem that unpredictable, right? You were so intimately tied with international affairs, even as a civil rights activist, and of course as congressman and mayor.
But that was the thing about Hartford Theological Seminary, that they had almost as many nationalities there as we have flags around this room. And it was every day. Well, one of my best friends had been a pilot in the Japanese Air Force. And he was working on a Master's of Sacred Theology, and he happened to be a good pool player. So he and I used to shoot pool in the basement, when we didn't feel like studying, and we'd always end up arguing about something. And then there were people from Europe, and there were missionaries from the Arab world, because there was always this Arab study. Well, Hartford Seminary had probably one of the best Islamic studies programs in the world. And I was thrown into an international university, which was passing itself off as a seminary. But the missionaries who were there had lived in, for 10, 20 years in places, and were coming back for refreshers. And we argued about what was going on in their countries, and they gave me their points of view. And that was my ace in the hole at the UN, because the State Department was listening to the CIA. And they were paying people to give them intelligence. And when you pay people for intelligence, they tell you what they think you want to hear. And I knew missionaries who had lived and worked with the people for 10, 15 years, spoke the language, and what I was hearing from them was completely different from the CIA reports I was reading. And so there was always a clash in the meetings, because I'd give the missionary point of view, and they'd look at me like I was crazy, except that Jimmy Carter Jimmy Carter, when we first went to Africa, I got him to go to the Lagos First Baptist Church of Lagos, Nigeria. And he gets up and he reads the Old Testament scripture, and he says, the first time I heard of Nigeria, my Baptist youth group was having a car wash to provide books for a Baptist missionary training school in, he said the name of the city. The president of Nigeria gets up and says, Mr. President, I want to thank you for those books. I was a barefoot boy that walked 3 miles every day, and I learned to read at that school. So, now, Nigerians are all very blunt, tough, insensitive people. I mean, they're not going to beat around the bush. They're going to lay it on the line. And that was the reputation that he had with the State Department. And everybody thought he was communist or militant or something. The guy was almost a saint. You know, and he and Carter hit it off immediately. I mean, he got along because he grew up in Plains, Georgia, which was 80% black. He got along better with black people than he did with people up north. He had trouble with northern white folk because they all thought he was ignorant because he talked with a southern accent. And so he never got the respect, even though he was finished near the top of his class at the Naval Academy and was picked by Admiral Rickover to be his assistant in developing a nuclear navy. But everybody thought of him as a peanut farmer, which he was. See? And but that's.
You know, one of the things, of course, we know that you spearheaded bringing the Olympics to Atlanta in 1996, and the Olympics historically have been these opportunities for people, for nations with whatever conflicts and tensions they have, to put them aside every 4 years for these games of competition. But right now in current events, there's been a systematic attempt to isolate Russia because of the violation of international law and the invasion of Ukraine. And there's a really kind of interesting moment when there seems to be a particular systematic move to isolate a nation for violating international law across sports in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, really, except for maybe South Africa, right? And I'm curious if you could, and maybe you have a different perspective, but
I do.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I would love to hear. I'm thinking.
President Carter pulled the United States out of the Olympics because of their entry into Afghanistan. Ted Turner, who was Jimmy Carter's good friend, decided that was not right. So he set up the Goodwill Games and took another American team to Russia because he felt, and though I love President Carter, that was one of the things I said that I didn't agree with, that I'd like to keep politics out of sport as much as possible. And because I think that we're going to need some way to get back with the Russians. You can't get along. You can't have a world with that big a landmass and that many people locked out of it just because they're bad. It's like sending your child to the closet. It really doesn't work. It makes you feel like you're doing something to discipline them, but the kid in the closet is just getting meaner and madder. But I was mayor of Atlanta when that happened, and we organized something called, well, there was already organized something called the Friendship Force that grew out of a pastor in Atlanta, and we decided to focus on Russia. And we had 3,000 Atlanta citizens go to the Soviet Union as tourists. And they ended up in Tbilisi in Soviet Georgia. And the 3,000 Atlantans added money to the trip so that they could bring 300 citizens of Tbilisi back to Atlanta. And they stayed in their homes, and they stayed for 2 weeks, you know, like we stayed for 2 weeks in Russia. We also brought somebody from the Chamber of Commerce, brought some business people, the television station brought a journalist back and gave him a report from Atlanta back to Tbilisi every day. And the thing that the Russian citizens that we brought to Atlanta were most thrilled about was the supermarkets. And we related to the Russians as people. And that's one of the reasons why we won the Olympics, because the Russians controlled about 16 votes out of the 85 votes that make the Olympic decision, and we got all 16 of the Russian votes. And we were able to put on the Olympics. Oh, I give Ted Turner the credit for orchestrating the Let's Make Russians Our Friends Again. And he should have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize for that, and for the fact that when he sold CNN to somebody, he gave $1 billion to the UN because the United States wouldn't pay his dues. And so he set up a nonprofit foundation, and he put $1 million of his money into the UN foundation to give the UN money that it could use for emergencies and anywhere in the world. And I think that he and Jimmy Carter are two of the most interesting people I've ever met. And they were both kind of crazy in a different way. Jimmy in a loving way, and Ted, Ted is a wild man, but he's a great American.
One of the quotes I have here of you mentioning President Carter, you mentioned that he was a citizen soldier, and ironically he was considered weak because he didn't kill anyone, and he didn't get anyone killed. So he is notable for being the first president since FDR not to invade a country or escalate an invasion from a predecessor. And so I think this is what that relates to. So diplomacy was very key with President Carter, and of course you were his ambassador for...
But everybody was his ambassador. When I was sworn in, he gave me a little note in his handwritten, and I didn't have sense enough to keep it. I want you to go to Africa, talk to as many African leaders as possible, and ask them what do they expect of this administration, and how can we help them. And but when Rosalind went to Mexico, he sent her with the same kind of note to talk to Lopez Portillo, but she went on to Panama and Costa Rica, and everybody told her that they wanted something done about the Panama Canal. Everybody in Africa told me they wanted to do something about apartheid. When Bob Strauss went to the Middle East, he got from both Sadat and Begin that they didn't want another war with each other. When Cy Vance went to Russia, the Russians really wanted to de-escalate the nuclear war threat because they realized that they couldn't keep up with the U.S. militarily. And they didn't want to be in an arms race. And so that led to a conference on disarmament. And Roseland's meetings led to Panama Canal Treaty. Bob Strauss meetings led to the talk between Egypt and Israel. And everybody thought all of those things were absolutely insane. And Jimmy Carter was blasted by the paper for being ignorant and naive. And yet they all happened. And they happened and didn't cost America any money, and they didn't cost us any lives, and we didn't kill anybody. And yet, the people who run the journalists and the television commentators still want to think of Jimmy Carter as weak. That means they are absolutely stupid. If they can't see the success of his administration, I don't know what they're doing. I mean, they're printing nonsense. And I guess I'm really disappointed in the media right now. I may be disillusioned because we depended so much on Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley, you know, when they spoke, you believed them. And now everything is so political and negative, and everybody wants to be Woodward and Bernstein and tell you what's wrong with government. Nobody needs to tell you what's wrong. They need to tell you what we need to do to make things right.
When we look at the invasion of Ukraine and the challenges of the global community, what do you think are some options? I know that avoiding violence seems to be paramount for the West, for most countries. But what do you think are some options that may or may not have been done right now? Or some options that might be on the table that we have not?
Well, believe it or not, and this is, Monday morning quarterbacking. The Senate would not have let him, but Joe Biden knew for 6 months ahead of the invasion that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. And if he'd had his way, I wish he'd started sending some weaponry then. It's just like, it's like Roosevelt. One of Roosevelt's finest hours, and I like the story because, well, they were sinking, the Germans were sinking merchant ships off the coast of Georgia. And nobody knew about it. And I mean, there were 2 or 3 ships that had been sunk by German torpedoes, submarines. And Franklin Roosevelt was really cool. And he got on a cruiser and went from Washington down to Barbados. And well, he no judgment, but he just happened to have 3 people that they said were his girlfriends on the same ship. Or they were close people to him. His wife and 2 other ladies, the Queen of Norway and I don't know, somebody else, but they went on a cruise to the Bahamas and they came back and to Barbados, way down. And when he came back, he talked about Lend-Lease. So, and he found a way to get weaponry into England that stopped Hitler. And I mean, we have had, all of my life, we've had some really great leadership, and in every crisis. And it seems as though whomever we elect manages to arise to the crisis. And because even though we disagree with half the people we elect, you know, I mean, I really didn't even think Bush was elected, the second one. But he put exactly the right tone on 9/11 and the relationships. I mean, every president of my lifetime has done something really splendid to make the world a better place. Now, they've also screwed it up at the same time, but they are human beings, and they do what human beings do. They do the best that they can, and most of the time, because we are a great country and we're surrounded by great people, most of the time they do what's right. And
I think we have a question from the audience.
We absolutely do. So I have a question here about America's role in the world. Many people have seen America's role in the world diminish. And some of you were at our program last week with Lech Walesa, who really argued that the U.S. needs to lead in the world again. Is this something you're concerned about? Is this, how do you see America's role in the world today
I mean, I
and
see
tomorrow?
America's role, I think we are leading. I mean, nobody since Roosevelt has gotten as many people together behind a single cause as Joe Biden. I mean, the expansion of NATO and the addition of Finland and Sweden changes the whole world. And even keeping Turkey in it. And I don't like Turkey particularly. But, you know, in terms of keeping the Russians neutralized, they are important. They're geographically important. See, I frankly am not nearly as concerned about China as everybody else is.
Why is that?
Because I went to China in 2000. In fact, I went to China 2 or 3 times while I was mayor, because we were trying to get that Hong Kong money into Atlanta. And we did. We got about $500 million out of Hong Kong reinvested in Atlanta. But in the course of that, I was talking with a lot of Chinese officials. And I remember I forget what they call it, the Ministry of Cultural Nationalities. And That's their race relations division. And it was headed by a Muslim Chinese. And he just opened his heart to me and said, I wish I could keep you with me for a while. He said, you all have done, he said, I know you got problems, he said, but you all have done such a good job integrating people into the United States that we could learn a lot from you. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And the figure he gave me was in the year 2000. He said, we have 142. He said, you all just have black and white and brown. He said, we have 142 tribal kingdoms that don't want to be a part of the Chinese government, state. And we forget that the Dalai Lama is Chinese. He can't go back to China because China is occupying Tibet and wherever it is he's from. Is that right? Tibet? Yeah. And but he said that, well, the Chinese government spends more on military stuff than we do. But they haven't had a war with anybody else outside of China since 1979. And I was at the UN, and let me tell that story because it's the way I think of democracy and diplomacy. When the Chinese came to the UN, they'd never been before. And when everybody got together to welcome them, all of the sophisticated diplomats, it turned out that nobody in the UN hierarchy really had much information about China. And it was embarrassing because the only thing they could think about to talk with was Chinese food. And there was some restaurant that Kissinger used to like that had good Chinese food in New York, and that's what they were talking about. My wife got disgusted, and she just thought she thought they were stupid. And she was a country girl from Alabama, and she could feel that everybody was stupid, especially me. But she went off and sat by herself, and lo and behold, the head of the Chinese delegation went and sat next to her. And his first word was, where you find good Georgia food. Now, they had not spoken a word of English to anybody. They were speaking in Chinese and being translated. He spoke in fluent English and wanted to talk about Southern food, see? And she said, only at our house, when are you coming to dinner? And I said, well, the UN ambassador then was living in the 42nd floor of the Waldorf. And I said, baby, you can't get no Georgia food in the Waldorf. And she said, yes, I can. I said, how? She said, my mother is driving up from Alabama. That's closest. And so her mother, who was in her late 70s, drove up with corn from her garden, greens from her garden, peas from her garden, you know, and the makings of cornbread, and she had somebody slow smoke some ribs and had them in a freezer chest. And I mean, she brought a whole station wagon full of Alabama food, really. And she went down in the Waldorf kitchen, and you know, a 75-year-old black woman in a kitchen ain't gonna take nothing from nobody. She said, now you all just stay out of my way. I'd like these 2 stoves. And when I get through, I will call you, and you can come and you can put the stuff on silver trays and get ready to serve it. And she just cooked a good Southern dinner. And so when we had by the time the Chinese showed up, we had dinner ready, and they served all this, you know, cornbread and ribs and fried chicken on silver plates, silver platters this big. And I remembered that everywhere I went in China, they had a lot to drink. And so I called a friend of mine back in Atlanta and said, what's a good Southern drink? And so he said, you ought to serve mint juleps. So when everybody walked in, they had a silver cup with what they maybe thought was iced tea. But it was pure bourbon. And a little sugar and mint and lemon. And it was a hot day, so you drink it down and you get another one. And so by the time we sat down for dinner, everybody, they cleaned up everything. And they picked up the chicken and ate it like we do. They chewed the rib bones. They ate all the cornbread. I mean, they were just like us. And afterwards, usually the UN dinners, they end pretty sharply about 9 o'clock, start about 7 and end at 9, and you have a toast to each other's countries and you go. Very formal. I don't know whether it was my hospitality or the mint juleps, but when we got through eating, everybody went into the living room and flopped down on the floor. And we must have talked until 1:30 in the morning. And it turned out that everybody in the Chinese delegation had gone to some school in the United States of America. And we spent the whole evening listening to their ideas about our country and our culture. And they all loved America. See? And they were envious, they were jealous, they figured, what can we do to make China more like you all? And they were at war with Vietnam. And I was the president of the Security Council, so I had to be the mediator. And I went to them and I said, you all have never been to the UN before. I said, but you're a founding member and you have an automatic veto. I said, now I have a resolution that's going to condemn your invasion of Vietnam. And he said, no, they invaded us first, and we pushed them out. And I said, well, you've been going at it for almost a year. And I said, we're going to condemn Vietnam too. But I said, now, we could never get my country to accept the condemnation for being in Vietnam or Korea, you know. And I said, if you would, he said, I wish you would show some leadership and accept the condemnation and authority of the United Nations. I said, you are wrong. And they said, yeah, but they started. I said, yeah, but we're going to condemn them too. And I said, you could set a new precedent. And I think the only time in the history of the United States, United Nations, that any founding member has accepted the condemnation of the United Nations for something they did was China abstained on that vote. And they've not had another war outside of China since 1979. But they still are spending more money on weaponry than we are. But they're using it against their own people. And so they are not, I think the one positive thing about the war in Ukraine is that Joe Biden has demonstrated that you can go to war without guns. that you can pull the strings on the banks, you can capture the yachts of the oligarchs. There are a lot of things you can do to cripple a country and to disrupt its politics without killing anybody. And I think we ought to be thinking about, well, if the Nobel Peace Prize people knew what they, I mean, if they understood the world as I do, they'd be thinking about how to give Joe Biden a Nobel Peace Prize for leading us and the world through one of the most difficult times in my lifetime. And
A quick question, Mr. Ambassador. I was thinking about the comment around China not going to war since 1979 outside of this country. And there was a political commentator who recently said that if you look at the history of Russia, that Russia has had, in this incarnation, if you include the Soviet Union, they've invaded countries, they've gone to war with countries that have only been at this border, right? Like sort of around and sent troops, but going far out is not something that they do either. And while the United States has not invaded the countries that border us, Mexico or Canada, not in the last 100 years at least, that there seems to be a sense that there may be, as you're saying, a predictability in how we might imagine this Putin's aggression, right? That it is that before Putin, that Russia has never gone out to, they always right around their borders. And is that something that you think that when we kind of think about predicting countries and how viable, you know?
no, when I was in Russia, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Yeah. And I just think it's a shame that they destroyed that beautiful city. And I think when I think of Russians, I don't just think of Stalin and Putin. I think of Dostoevsky. I think of the Bolshoi Ballet. I think of you know, I mean the rich culture and heritage that has been produced by these people, and that's not who's in charge, but that's still there. And I think we've seen it. I mean, I am so proud of the people from Ukraine. I mean, they have stood the test. And on the news this morning, somebody was planting flowers because it's just getting to be springtime. And to think in the middle of this that they have never given up, and they're going to come back. And the people we have heard on television, I don't know where they get them from, but they all speak very good English. They all are very articulate and thoughtful, and they will not be held down.
So we're going to go a little bit longer. You just mentioned that you were the president of the Security Council. We do have a question about the relevance of the United Nations as a body. Is it time to be, and I say this, and everyone understand that the biggest thing that the World Affairs Council does every year is our Model United Nations program. So, you know, is the UN still a relevant organization? How might the Security Council reform to fit the world today?
The UN is only as strong as, right now, the President of the United States would allow it to be. We run the UN, and we run it good or bad. We are a much stronger influence in the world than we ought to be. And because usually the U.S. doesn't listen to anybody. The one thing about Carter was he asked people what they thought. And he made everything we talked about had to go through the UN at some time or other. The Panama Canal stuff was there, Camp David, the disarmament with the Russians. All of that went through the UN. But it didn't start in the UN, it started in the White House. But it really didn't just start in the White House. It started because the White House asked people what they thought. And we had a Democratic White House, small d. Most of the time, we have a little too much arrogance amongst most Americans. All of us. We think we're better than anybody else, and including me. But when we sit down and listen, or when you have to, I think people are learning a lot from the Ukrainians, just hearing their news here on television, and we're getting to know. The thing that Carter did with Africa was he brought more African leaders into the White House to visit than anybody else in our history. And what he heard, he did something about. Yeah.
So I do have several questions. So this isn't necessarily world events, but it absolutely impacts world events. The current state of the civil rights movement, the current state of racial equity in the United States. So many questions are on this. But I'm asking this in a week where we just experienced what happened in Buffalo, right? So many people want to hear your thoughts on where we are as a nation today.
Let me say that we had one sick kid kill 10 people. That is awful. But in 1960 to 62, before we went into Birmingham, there were 60 bombings of people's homes in Birmingham that didn't even make the newspaper in Atlanta, 150 miles away. See? And the thing about race relations now is the whole world had to watch George Floyd die because one young lady had a cell phone and photographed it. And that was a horrible thing. We started the civil rights movement in some ways. Rosa Parks was motivated in part by Emmett Till's murder. But we didn't know about Emmett Till's murder until his mother allowed Ebony to take his picture with an open coffin. And I'm not saying that things are, well, I am saying that things now are better in the United States of America than they have ever been in my 90 years of life. I mean, I lived on the corner. I was 50 yards from the headquarters of the Nazi Party. I spent all my life around racists. And white supremacy, my daddy said, was a sickness. And you don't get upset with sick people. You have to, you don't want to get too involved in them because you don't want to catch their bitterness. And he took me to see Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics movie. And when Hitler walked out on Jesse Owens ignored him. And just went on and won 3 more gold medals. there is evil in the world. There will always be evil in the world. But the evil that exists in the world is not determinative of the state of the world.
One of the things you mentioned, Ambassador Young, as we all know, is a civil rights activist and had been arrested in Atlanta, among many places, and then, of course, became mayor of Atlanta. And you got a chance to see the city of Atlanta transform in all sorts of fascinating ways, but you saw the intolerance of people. In 1962, I believe, hotels in Atlanta made an agreement that they would actually allow black people to come inside the hotel. They couldn't go above the second floor, and they could not consume anything more than water. So there were conventions across the country that just, if they had any black members, the black members would not be able to be in hotels in Atlanta. So the American Historical Association didn't meet in Atlanta, for example, right? Although we have a very small number of African American historians. And so the city of Atlanta said, hey, we'll be progressive by, at least they can walk in the door, and they can't go past the second floor. That's progress, right? And so, but there's a quote.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating history. The interesting thing is that when we talk about transforming systems, I guess to your point here, that you can make an attempt to transform someone's heart, right? And to some degree of success. But then when you transform systems, that even people who are racist now will go to a hotel where there are black folks on the 8th floor, the 2nd floor, the 10th floor, and they'll sleep well at night. They'll be in a restaurant, and across the room there might be a black family or black couple, table over. They'll still enjoy their food and be happy. And then it's kind of fascinating. I'm thinking about strategies towards social transformation of the heart, but also there are structures in place, right? Like, as you and I know, things are much better. There are people whose hearts are still quite racist, but they become tolerant of situations that they would not have been tolerant of before. And I'm thinking about the global stage. And I'm thinking about South Africa and apartheid. A colleague of mine, Richard Wilson at UCONN, said that he met police officers in South Africa who would beat children who tried to integrate parks, right? And they would throw everything into swinging the clubs. He said once apartheid came to an end, those same police officers had the same jobs, and they would police the parks and be completely indifferent to the children.
You know, my son went to Howard, and the first day of school, he got beat up by 5 black policemen. You know, I mean, and they broke his leg in the daytime at Howard University
In Washington, D.C.
in Washington, D.C. And that was in the 60s or 70s. No, I probably was the mayor then, so that was in the 80s. So now, police in Washington don't have to go to college. They're high school graduates, and they needed police officers. So they gave them some training. But when they look at Howard University, all they see is the pretty girls that won't speak to them. Because the girls at Howard are looking for lawyers and doctors like you know, and they don't bother the policemen. That's not something they're interested in. And so the police don't like Howard University. The black police don't like Howard University. I don't know what that is, but that's a sickness.
So when you think
Now,
about
but let me say that what I see, I had a good dinner last night. But when I go to dinners at places like this in Atlanta, in the last 2 years, I have not been in a restaurant that's charging at least $100 per person with no alcohol. I haven't been in a restaurant that hasn't had at least as many black folk in it as they have white folk. And I can't afford to go to those restaurants for once in a while. When I go, it's because somebody else takes me. See, but I don't know where these Negroes are getting all this money. See? Except that there are 4,000 new jobs that Google brought in. And the guy running Google in Atlanta is a young black man about your age. you know, and he's one of the city fathers now. And Microsoft's got 10,000. And I mean, the airport earned $66 billion last year in a bad year. And it dropped for a little while to second in the world. Now it's the busiest airport in the world. And I don't know that, I mean, it wasn't planned for me, but I just dropped in on one of the management meetings just to say hello. And there were 2 white people, 5 black women, and 2 or 3 black men. And they're running a multi-billion-dollar operation.
The busiest airport in the world.
But it's the most profitable airport in the world, and we built it with no taxpayer money. We did not go to Washington and beg. We went to Wall Street and put together a deal. And we might have close to $10-12 billion into that airport. And it generates jobs, and it has, I mean, the economy of metropolitan Atlanta is the same size as the economy of Norway. And crazy black folk have done that.
So part of this question is to tie into what I was saying.
No, I'm saying that the progress of black people doesn't depend on the behavior of white people.
Thank you. So to the point of structural and moral change, the city of Atlanta, your predecessor as mayor, Maynard Jackson, had a lot of attack from the white business class. When you came in...
No, Maynard was arrogant. He was one of the most arrogant Morehouse men I know. No, but no, Maynard's grandfather made him wear a shirt and tie to come to dinner in his own house. He couldn't say a Bible verse. He had to say some kind of Shakespearean sonnet. Like we say Bible verse on Sundays when we eat. He had to have a new sonnet that he'd memorized. I mean, Maynard was a black aristocrat. His grandfather had 4 daughters. 3 of them had PhDs, and the 4th one was an opera singer in Europe. I mean, he was, and he, on top of that, he was about 6'3", and he weighed about 275 pounds. And when he walked in the room, you know, they said when he squeezes through the door, the wood starts shaking in the floor. Because that cat is fat. See? And, but he was an arrogant aristocrat. And black people are not supposed to come like that in Georgia. But he was that way with black people. Black people were uncomfortable with Maynard, see? But that was Maynard. But he was the one that got together and instead of coming to Washington, went to Wall Street. I'm mad at Morehouse because Morehouse doesn't appreciate him. Morehouse has no understanding of what Maynard Jackson did for Atlanta.
There's actually a center named after you at Morehouse.
And not one named after Maynard.
So Maynard Jackson, for everyone here, had perhaps the most aggressive and effective affirmative action programs for any city in the United States. But Mayor Young continued that, but at the same time did not isolate himself from the white business class. In fact, the concentration to this day.
But see, there again. Maynard was 32 when he became mayor. I was 50. And I had been to the UN, I had been to Congress, I'd been to more than 100 countries in the world. and I had maybe 75 honorary degrees, at least. So so I was not insecure about anything. And he was, and he had a right to be insecure at 32, being the first black mayor in the South, see? But he couldn't help the fact, he could have helped the fact that he weighed 275 pounds. And eventually he did. You know, he came down and, but his father died when he was about 15. And to get to law school, he sold Bibles and encyclopedias to people door to door. Now you gotta have some chutzpah to try to sell an encyclopedia to a poor black person in North Carolina. So you can get by with the Bible, but selling encyclopedias? See? And that's how he got through law school. Because by that time, his father died when he was very young. His grandfather by that time was dead. His 3 PhD aunts were brilliant, but they weren't rich. And it's hard to be smart and have no money. But that was why he was so threatening to the white business community, because he spoke Shakespearean English. And Southerners speak lazy. And Maynard spoke every single syllable distinctly. And that made very rich white Southerners insecure. Now, the other thing, though, is the business community reached out to him, and they supported him. Coca-Cola led his election. When I ran, they decided they didn't want any more black folk running the city. And I told them I thought I could win without them, but I said, you know, and I ran anyway. And when I won, we had the results by Wednesday. I had the president of Coca-Cola invite the business community to a fancy restaurant for lunch, and there were 85 CEOs of corporations there. And I said, look, I won without you, but I can't run the city without you. And I didn't want this job. And you're gonna pay me $50,000 a year to take care of all your problems. I said, I don't mind that, but I can't do it without your help. I said, now if I screw up, I'll just have a bad reputation and then I'll go somewhere and get me a good job. See? But your companies will hurt if I'm not a good mayor. So I gave everybody my home phone number. And I said, I'm gonna count on you to tell me what to do and to tell me when I'm doing something wrong. Now, very few people called me, but I did get a couple of calls, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, but they were from Japan. So, but I gave every investor coming to the city, I said, you don't have to pay anybody under the table, and if you're not getting good service, don't complain about it, call me. And I was completely open and transparent, and I went out of my way to see people.
And I close by stating that when Ambassador Young ran, he got, if I recall the numbers correctly, 55% of the vote. But when you ran for the second time, it was 80% of the vote. And the city of Atlanta.
Well, I was the first mayor since Mayor Hartsfield in 1946 to get a majority of the white vote. You know, and because, I mean, white Atlanta didn't even want good white mayors. They were, you know, it's like people, it's like, I mean, it's really sick to, I hope, well, I guess you all are mostly Democrats, but I mean, the Republican Party is, and I voted Republican when I went to Georgia. I voted Republican in New York, but there's some, they don't understand, or they don't believe in what's real is real. And there's a sickness. I mean, the people who voted the other day against giving baby food to babies, I mean, and one of them is a congresswoman from Georgia who believes in all that QAnon stuff, and I don't understand that. So, but this country right now is doing in many ways better than it's ever done in my lifetime. At the same time, it's sicker than it's ever been in my lifetime.
Well, on that positive note, I really want to, words cannot quite describe my enthusiasm to sit next to you, Ambassador Young, really. And I am in huge awe, I'm a huge fan. There are all these stats I would love to share about how he left Atlanta. I gave you the 80%. There are more African-American millionaires in Atlanta than any other city, more black businesses in Atlanta than any other city. The percentage of African-Americans in those metro areas is 40% higher than African-Americans in other parts of the country. African-Americans are overrepresented in the city structure, from white-collar jobs through the lower jobs. And so much has been a consequence of the policies put in place by Mayor Young. And there's so much more we can say about the airport. 18 years straight of being the busiest airport on the planet. It's been under executive black leadership ever since the 80s, right? So we're talking about busier than LAX, you name it, de Gaulle, JFK, and it's been under exclusive black leadership for almost 40 years. And so there's so much to say about what Atlanta has become, but it has become because of this stalwart leadership of the gentleman right here, and the legacy and the standard he established for subsequent mayors. Thank you so much for everything here. We've run out of time.
I'm gonna close. Ambassador Young, are there any final thoughts you wanna leave us with today? I know you started by saying that your outlook for the state of the world is positive, right? And that's not something we hear all of the time at the World Affairs Council. But what sort of final thoughts do you have for us today?
Well, who's the lady married to Jamaican? I was telling her that one of my favorite songs is, how does it go? It's a Bob Marley song.
Everything's gonna be all right?
Everything's gonna be all right. That's the, yeah. And it's, well, Shakespeare says the best of times and the worst of times, or something like that. That's where we are. But don't let, well, the way my grandpa used to say it, don't let the bastards get you down.
That's a perfect way to Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Ambassador Young, for joining us, and everyone here today. It was really an insight, a historical day for us at the World Affairs Council. And thank you to Mark Steinberg and Peter Kelly again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Young.